For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There's still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Today, my guest is Tao Orion, author of Beyond the War on Invasive Species, one of my favorite books. Tao holds a degree in Agroecology and Sustainable Agriculture from UC Santa Cruz and an MSc degree in Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security from the National University of Ireland, Galway. She's the author of Beyond the War on Invasive Species by Chelsea Green Publishing, 2015. Tao also serves on the Lane Community Climate Advisory Committee, the board of directors of the Center for Rural Livelihoods, and is the founding member of Cottage Grove Climate Action. She's also an instructor in the Permaculture program at Oregon State University. It's an honor for me to have her on the show. All right, well, thank you for coming on to the Rewilding podcast.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
I have a funny, we've known each other for a while. I read your book years ago, Beyond the War on Invasive Species. I have it right here. For me, it was like, and it has been in my top 5 like rewilding books ever since I read it. I think for me, it's like an updated, newer Silent Spring. I think it's, on par, if not more important. It's urgent. It's more, it's more urgent now than even Silent Spring was. It's more broadly appealing. There's a lot more, I think, in there that people can do with the information. And, I think I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a long time anyway, just because obviously your book is in my top 5. I want to have you on the Rewilding podcast. But what pushed me over the edge to reach out to you recently was our social media accounts person posted the book on our Instagram or something, because we sell it through Rewild Portland on our website. And she was doing a little sales pitch type of a thing. And some Instagram account started railing against oh, there's no war against invasive species. This is just absurd, blah, 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 blah. And it was just it made me so angry that there's just this sort of people don't even want to look into what it means. They're just immediately have this sort of reactionary hatred toward invasive species. And, I just think it's so interesting, especially because the whole first chapter of your book kind of goes into some of the psychology behind that, or where that idea comes from, and so I thought we could just start super basic for anybody who's just kind of becoming aware of the themes of your work, and just start with asking, I'd like to ask you, what are invasive species?
Well, that's a great question. Well, I kind of think of them as species that have come into ecosystems that are disturbed in some way. And, I kind of think of them as symptoms of ecological change, and use them to kind of help read the landscape and read some of the history that's occurred there, and try to use them to kind of frame solutions about more regenerative ways of engaging with the landscape into the future. So I see them more as, they're parts of the landscape that we're living in now, and they can be frustrating and annoying and hard to conceive of how to manage, but they have a place and they have a story to tell. And I think it's important to really get into the weeds, as it were, to try to understand why they appear when they do, and what's happened in that landscape to kind of create the conditions that allow them to thrive. And those are some of the questions that, I think people want, to look deeper into that. I think can get into some of those questions that challenge people and make them that's kind of at the root of the frustration,
Hmm.
that people feel with them.
Yeah, so that's cool that, thinking about disturbance, like can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like if they're, I think some people have this notion that they're like colonizing forces, that they're, um, you know, coming in and just taking over a thing. But you mentioned they're like a disturbance adapted species, essentially. Can you kind of talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the big pieces of the conversation around invasive species has to do with the colonization in general and the massive disturbances that have happened ecologically in the wake of European interests massively changing, land management and displacing indigenous people and their land management. And so, a lot of people equate invasive species with colonizing species, and they are. But I think the more important part of that conversation is the lack of indigenous management in many spaces due to that historic displacement. And if we can kind of get back to that and, think about having indigenous people manage their land again, which is happening in many different places, I think that we can address the root of what's driving species invasions in many ecosystems. And that's not often part of the conversation in many restoration and conservation circles. And there's this idea that invasive species just kind of appear in this static landscape and take it over and mess it up. But what's missing from that conversation is, again, the fact that these natural, quote unquote, landscapes were managed by people. And by taking the people off of the land, you change the dynamics of the ecosystem substantially and you leave it open to invasion, especially when you do other things like dam the rivers and kill all the beavers and plow the
Right.
fields and have massive numbers of grazing animals that also change the landscape.
Mm.
So we have to kind of come to terms with what we've done and what we participate in this, modern context and understand the ramifications that it has on the landscape.
Yeah, awesome.
So,
So, in the title, Beyond the War on Invasive Species, like this social media post person that was, ranting about how war was this, it was an overuse of the word, or was not right, or what, I don't know what they were trying to say. I think they just didn't understand the amount of chemical weapons, and that was the reference to war is chemical weapons, correct?
yeah, and to me, it's kind of the sense that if we were to just remove X, Y, or Z, that ecosystems would be okay. Like this idea that we
Mm,
can like take something out and then it will be better. It's kind of this conventional approach, conventional in the terms of like agriculture, where it's like, oh, if you just eliminate the pest, then everything will be okay. Um, you're not really looking at the fact that you may have decimated the whole ecosystem, and that might be why the pest is thriving. So the idea that there's an enemy in an ecological system rather than something that's showing you how things could be better
mm,
is kind of what I'm trying to get at
mm.
in writing that book, and also just in the work that I do every day is helping people understand land processes and human processes in land better. So
Yeah, awesome.
some ecological literacy.
Yeah, totally. What led you to like dive into this topic, or did you have like an experience with invasive species that made you like question the way people were approaching it? Like, was there like an inspirational moment, or you know what I mean, like a pivotal point?
Well, I have always been interested in organic agriculture and, kind of committed to that. And that's been my educational background and my work background is, managing organic farms prior to writing this book. And um, when I got a job doing ecological restoration just as kind of a on a whim, because I do have a background in botany. I knew about invasive species, and I'd never really like focused on it as a concept. But when I got this job on the first day, my supervisor pretty much said, "Okay, so here's this spot. We broadcast sprayed Roundup for the last 2 years, and you're going to be spot spraying all the invasives across the 64-acre site." And I was like, "Wait, what? I thought I was going to be doing restoration. Why am I going to be spraying herbicide? Like, I'm not going to spray herbicide. Maybe this is not the right job position for
Yeah,
me."
right.
And so we kind of got into it a little bit, and I was just pretty firm about the fact that I have these skills in organic systems management, and I can offer that to this position. We can come up with other solutions, um, and they agreed. And part of that process for me was kind of researching some of the
Mm,
literature around invasive species. It kind of really got me thinking, like, why is this such a thing in the restoration conservation movement? Like, why are people so focused on this to the point of broadcast spraying Roundup, and then at the same time going to the store and buying organic food? I mean, it
right.
made no sense to me.
Yeah,
Because these are systems that they're wetlands, and they're places where you wouldn't expect that kind of activity to be happening. Not like it should be happening on farms either, but people kind of associate it more there. Um,
totally.
but yeah, that was definitely a pivotal moment for me.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting, like trying to work, here in Portland, we have Rewild Portland, we do some work with invasive species and removal, and we're sort of butting heads at this point around utilizing any of the invasive species to do weaving projects and stuff like that because of the amount of chemicals that they spray on the plants here, particularly
Oh wow.
glyphosate, Ranger Pro, and other things. Um, and yeah, there was actually recently an article that came out about the herbicide use in Portland, and people have
Hmm.
been starting to speak up and complain about the number of or the amount. And the parks people are like, well, water is literally in the Oregonian article. They said, well, water is toxic in certain quantities. So,
Oh, so they're really
yeah,
pushing back.
yeah, pretty hard. Um, yeah,
Well, and that's, I mean, I feel like this topic goes so deep into our whole kind of narrative of civilization, because, just this idea that there's parks and there's these areas that are set aside that should look a certain way, and we should utilize them in certain ways, it's all very much part of a certain philosophy of embeddedness or not in the
yeah,
natural
totally.
world. And
Yeah,
that is, I think, what underlies a lot of this ideology, is that humans are separate, but we need nature. So we like set aside these places that we can go to, but they're all very trimmed and neat,
hmm,
and we use it in a certain way by like walking through, but you don't steward it, or the expectation is that
right,
you don't
exactly.
participate
Yeah,
in, and instead you hire people to spray
yeah.
stuff. That's kind of the extent of the relationship.
Hmm.
But so breaking that down, I think, is really important. And sounds like you're working the various angles,
Trying.
trying
Yeah,
to.
we're mostly working with private property owners now in places where there's invasive species that we know haven't never been sprayed, or at least within 10 years or so. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
funny, there's even a park in town where they did a pilot program for um, organic herbicide or just no herbicide, and it was managed by the neighborhood. But even then, they did lots of mulching and stuff like that around trees, but people in the neighborhood didn't know, what was going on. So they would just like take their Roundup over there, and like start spraying it in the park, even though they were like, there's, people trying not to do it. It's just like so pervasive, I think, in most people's minds that this is just what is done. Um, Even when, it's being managed as an organic park, people are still going there and spraying because they just have no clue. But
They can't help it.
yeah, yeah, it's just so ingrained in there. Um, I'm going to skip to a different question because this relates to kind of what we're talking about
Mhm.
right now, which is my friend Colton had this question. Beyond the War focuses heavily on like non-city ecologies. Sites proposed for restoration, restorative ecology, like old agricultural public lands, things like that. Do you have any kind of like plans that you've done before, or like an idea of what it would look like to utilize this stuff in an urban context? Given that urban contexts are probably more prone to intense disturbance or invasion because of the amount of disturbance that's just like repetitive in those places. Um, yeah, I don't know. I have this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, go ahead.
No, 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 you.
Well, I mean, I think to me, there's kind of a couple questions there. One is kind of like the redesign of common space in cities, and what do we use these spaces for? What do we outsource to other landscapes? And I always think about food production, and so there's layers to the understanding like the type of landscape that you'd like to see, because that should always kind of guide your the implementation approach that you take. So if you're wanting it to be mostly native, like a park, say in a city, then that would lead you to a certain set of management decisions. And I think, if you're not using herbicide, you could think about, really having like high levels of civic engagement and having people, feel a real sense of stewardship over parks, which would be cool. There's also more examples, I would say, of animals in parks.
Mm,
That's becoming more and more of a popular approach for invasive species
interesting.
management, especially in like fire prone areas. It's definitely
Mm,
taking off more in California, but there's a couple places and businesses that do that in Oregon and Washington that I'm aware of. Um, and that can also be part of a food system, whether that's dairy or meat production, from goats or sheep that are out there making
yeah.
use of all of that vegetation. Um, so there's like, I think, a few different ways to think about it. Having a perfectly manicured lawn, um, like is the case in some of the parks in Portland and elsewhere, is harder to achieve, you know. Um, but I would question whether or not that's really like the highest goal, like the highest utilization of that
Mm,
site. So
totally.
if all of that is on the table, then we can start to get a lot more creative with how we're imagining those spaces and utilizing them.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see like how policies change around land use as the collapse intensifies, as food distribution systems start to break down and people have to actually
Yeah.
like, get food from as local as possible. And it makes me think of like, the victory gardens kind of stuff, but that happened during World War II,
Yeah.
Um, One time I was walking down the trail at Oaks Bottom, which is a wildlife refuge in
Mm.
Portland, and there was like lemon balm growing on the side of the trail. And I just kind of started snacking on it. And I go maybe like 20 feet down the trail. Here comes from the other direction the parks department, and they've got the backpacks on and they're spraying it all with glyphosate, right? And thankfully it's got like the blue dye, so at least that lasts
Oh,
for a
right.
couple of days. Let you know.
Yeah.
I mean, most of that stuff just washes away, when it rains here. But I just had this like sinking feeling in my chest. Like here's this medicine food. What if there was like a neighborhood group? Even if it was just like a parks like a neighborhood stewardship coordinator, right? That was like, hey, it's time to harvest all the lemon balm. We're going to make medicine. Like everybody show up and we're going to harvest it. We're going to have like a lemon balm harvesting party. We're going to make salve. We're going to make tea, dry out the leaves, like all these different things. And then the community's coming together, participating in nature, meeting each other, harvesting something that's considered invasive that is being managed in that way, producing medicine for each other, like, and tea, sedative, relaxing tea. It's just interesting, like how that to me isn't innovative. That to me is like, like, where did we go? How did we get so far away from those kind of things? And how do we like work our way back now? But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. And I think, really considering the opportunities for social and environmental engagement that lies within some of these things that look like challenges, just brings, so much potential. And I think, especially in urban spaces where you have kind of a high concentration of people, like doing things like that, um, is just, it's limitless. And it's exciting to me to hear about things like that. I kind of wonder if the Parks Department might be open to doing something like that. I was in contact with somebody at Metro several years ago who was in charge of, spraying a big portion of this popular trail and forest park. And then he brought his 2-year-old daughter to like, kind of show her where he worked. And then he was like, oh, I don't really want to be bringing my 2-year-old daughter to walk through here.
Yeah.
It took him like, having that visceral experience of being like, oh, you can't touch that. Don't touch it. Don't go anywhere. Don't crawl around.
Right. Yeah.
To have that kind of change in perspective. And then this was a few years ago now, but he was talking about having this one area that they were going to kind of let him experiment with.
Mm-hmm.
So I could put you in touch with him. Oh, please.
Yeah. That would be awesome. I mean, it's interesting too, because, Seattle has been doing some innovative stuff as a city around this, they have proven that it's like, it can be affordable for the city to invest in not using herbicides. And Portland just keeps using that excuse that they did one test almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and said it was more expensive, way more expensive. But then how come all these other cities have had other test sites that have shown that it's cheaper, and Portland is just essentially ignoring those? But there's sort of a question there too of like, in terms of collapse, right? Like how much time and energy do I want to have? I mean, this is a existential question, not a, but it's like how much time and energy to spend trying to change the bureaucratic system that might be in shambles and completely inoperable in a few years, right? So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that really, but it's just the things that roll around in my head when I'm trying to engage where we are right now, because it's still here. They're still the ones in charge. So how do we, kind of navigate this gray zone?
Maybe you can plant some oaks and chestnuts in the margins and just cut back the Scotch broom and the blackberry trees around
exactly.
them and mulch them.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of guerrilla gardening going on for sure. That made me think of something else that I wanted to ask, but it slipped away from me. Yeah, I mean, another kind of shifting gears a little bit too, just in terms of the word rewilding itself, having this sort of, obviously the Rewilding podcast, my version of rewilding is from this older thing that came out of Earth First. It's like the anarcho, the primal anarchy version of rewilding. And there's the more prevalent now, at least in the media, rewilding is this sort of conservation biology notion of rewilding. Which is usually just sort of like a laissez-faire, hands-off. No, like humans are bad. There was even a book that came out around the same time as yours that I read called The New Wild, which was basically similarly about invasive species, but their whole premise was like, there's nothing we can do, get over it, it's already happened. Like, why even try? And it was just a disappointment. I mean, that's why, you know, every time I bring up your book, if somebody's read that one, they're like, oh, yeah, I read this other book, The New Wild. And I'm like, you got to read Beyond the
Right.
War instead, because it actually gives people like, you know, tangible things to do that isn't just like, well, that's, I guess there's nothing we can do about it. I really hated that part of the book, of that book, you know, The New Wild. Um, but I'm curious if you could speak to that a little bit too, just that notion of wildness being sort of like hands off, and you know, how your book is different in terms of like giving practical ideas of how to manage landscapes and how to sort of, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, I was influenced pretty strongly by the work of Kat Anderson and her book, Tending the Wild, and some of her other research, and the research of Nancy Turner and others, and also just working with tribal communities here where I live in Oregon, and understanding the immense value of native plants and the relationship that people have with them. And that being so influential in my own understanding of ecology has kind of shaped the way that I think about restoration and invasive species management, because I really see taking people out of ecosystems, it has led to all kinds of problems in many respects. And the idea of the wilderness idea of kind of keeping people out of the frame except as visitors, is one that is heavily influenced by colonial ideology. There's always, at least in North, South, Central America, Australia, New Zealand, there's always been people present, and they've participated in making it as biodiverse as it has been. And so, I think that there's value in having spaces free from extractive capitalism. And
Right.
but that doesn't mean that's always what people do. People can
Totally.
do things much differently, and that's the space that I really like to explore, because I think people can be good stewards. I think indigenous people have um, laid the groundwork for that all over the world for millennia. Um, a different way of relating to the land through extracting natural resources and making money off of them has come onto the scene relatively recently and spread across the globe. But that ideology isn't the whole of human nature. And I really think that coming to an understanding of how we can participate in active management, not for money making, but for subsistence and biodiversity enhancement, is really where we should be aiming ourselves. So,
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think too about how you know, some of the origins of the anarcho-primitivism rewilding is definitely like this notion of going back to being hunter-gatherers, or being immediate return hunter-gatherers,
mhm.
where, you know, I think in terms of the way that I understand rewilding, I also was heavily influenced by Kat Anderson and Nancy Turner and Doug Doyer. Um, and, you know, for me, it's definitely kind of thinking forward. You know, obviously not everybody can go back to being a hunter gatherer. Like, that way of life was dependent on a particular ecology that doesn't exist anymore, right? It was mostly megafauna that allowed
Mhm.
people to live like that. And so there's this interesting thing with rewilding of, you know, returning to a relationship of reciprocity as opposed to any particular type of subsistence strategy like hunting and gathering or something, right? So
Mhm.
I feel like your book does a really good job of kind of like bridging some gaps around that for people in particular, thinking about,
Mhm.
you know, because I think a question I get a lot is like, well, if you're advocating for rewilding, you know, how do you expect 8 billion people or whatever to go back to being hunter gatherers? And it's like, well, that's not rewilding,
Exactly.
right? And that's where I think permaculture and horticulture are essentially our future, at least, you know, in the next couple thousand years. Who
Yeah.
knows what'll come after that? But just that notion of, I think, is really important for people to understand that wildness doesn't mean completely unmanaged, but means a particular type of management, a particular type of relating to the other things in the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of it as a relationship, and so much of our modern world has appeared to remove us from our relationship and our embeddedness in the natural world, but we've never left. We're still in it, and
Unfortunately,
everything
right,
that we do
exactly.
affects it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So, um, kind of examining those threads and thinking about how, those relationships might come a little bit closer and, have more effects on where you actually live and more engagement with where you actually, survive and thrive,
Yeah.
I think is what people can do now. And that's going to look a variety of different ways depending on where you live and the other species around you. But there's lots of things that we can do.
Yeah. It makes me think too, I just, in terms of, I'm always thinking across spectrums, right? So like there's landowners, like people who have gardens that or yards that they can manage. And then there's like, renters who have sort of, challenging here and there to do things, but you could get like a garden plot. It also makes me think of, the challenges of being houseless and not having that, and the sort of guerrilla gardens that can be
Yeah.
created. Like I just read a thing about a houseless man in Seattle who like kept getting kicked out of wherever it was that he was camping, and then eventually like went to the forest outside Seattle, or up and started like this community and has been gardening and stuff. And now they're like getting threatened to be kicked out again, like right as the harvest season is coming up. And it's just interesting the sort of challenges that we all kind of face. And I think about, um, you know, I just keep thinking more and more about guerrilla gardening, and like you were saying about planting trees. I mean, because at some point, what are they going to do? Like people are going to need to be, we're going to be needing to be feeding ourselves from the place, and
Yeah.
um, yeah, I just think that there's certain people that in some ways are ahead of the curve because they're already living in that sort of stateless um, zone, right? And so I feel like,
Yeah.
that when I'm looking for like inspiration, I often will look at, people who are already living that kind of stateless uh, existence, even though I know it's hard for lots of other reasons. And I don't want to romanticize it
Right.
in particular ways. I think that
Right.
there's also some really innovative stuff happening that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah. I mean, actually, something I thought about, and I think I mentioned this in my book too, but in outside the town where I live, there's like this nature park area that has all of this reed canary grass, but it's kind of like a Western pond turtle habitat. And it's also an area where many people who lack housing camp. And so there's kind of this simultaneous endeavor to get rid of the reed canary grass, as well as to constantly be moving people and their belongings out of this space. And so, one concept would be, well, why don't you stop, being at war with both and
Right.
find ways that maybe the people who are camping there can help steward the space. If
Yeah.
if your goal is to remove reed canary grass, like there could be a whole kind of focused endeavor on that the people who are living there can engage in, rather than trying to kind of always push things to the margins and just, spray them out of existence in the
Mm,
hopes that it can get back to some idealized state. Like we're not
totally.
there. it's not
Yeah.
it's not happening, and you can't
Yeah.
make things disappear. um, and so finding these creative solutions that can, you know meet multiple needs at once, I think is also an important feature of future
Mm,
casting,
mm,
future
hmm.
designing.
Are there any projects you're working on right now that that involve invasive species, like transformative, particularly with invasive species? Any zones like farmlands that are totally taken over by like blackberries or something like that?
Well, I've been working with um, over the years, there's been some pushback by different agencies and people that work at different agencies about the concept, but there's also been a lot of like welcoming of the idea. And so I've been working with the Lower Nehalem Watershed Council on the north coast of
Hmm.
Oregon to help develop a pilot program to manage Japanese knotweed with
Yeah.
pigs and
Oh, wow.
goats
Interesting.
instead of herbicide.
Huh.
And that's
Because
another,
herbicide
plant that
doesn't
has a
work,
lot of,
right? With knotweed.
I mean, you have to use a lot. You have to use a lot.
Yeah.
It's a very, very hardy plant.
Yeah.
And pairing that with actual riparian restoration and addressing the timber
Mm.
industry
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
would be necessary to really, lift the ecosystem back to its former state,
Totally. Yeah.
which a lot of agencies aren't really willing to talk about the timber industry.
Mm. Hmm.
Um, but that's been an interesting project. And then another friend who works at the Longtom Watershed Council, and they've been doing a lot of really great work with prescribed fire and other, non-herbicide management. But they're doing another pilot program for grazing
Hmm.
for various invasive species with goats and sheep. Um, and so, I think little by little, there's these kind of pockets of interest. And I think just showing that it's possible to engage with land in a different way. And, I think particularly in spaces where people are hoping there's going to be more native plant diversity, um, showing that there's alternative options is important. And
Totally.
so the prescribed fire, which is the cultural, largely a major historical cultural management tool. And then, grazers in places where fire might not be as appropriate
Mm.
given private property boundaries and fuel loads increases that we've seen over the past several decades can kind of work in concert in different places. So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, that is exciting. It makes me think too of again, there's another houseless community. Well, I mean, they have houses now, but it's a little community called Hazelnut Grove, and I think it was started during,
Oh,
I want to say, like the Occupy movement, like
hmm.
years ago. And the neighborhood association in this neighborhood is very wealthy and does not like this encampment there. And it's at the bottom of a bluff that is covered in Himalayan blackberry that dries out, and then there's like houses
Hmm.
above. So one of their excuses for trying to push the people out of there was fire danger. And now
Hmm.
they actually have, it's like you're saying, places where you can't burn. They actually have goats, and the goats have completely
Oh,
chewed out
wow.
and eaten like all of the
Oh,
blackberries. So now it's
nice.
just this nice manicured, I mean, it's steep.
Wow.
It's a steep cliff, right? I mean, a hillside or whatever, it's very steep, but the goats just like hang out there. And I walk by it from time to time, and it's just really cool to see because it's completely fenced in, the whole
That's
site.
awesome.
But then they have like this fencing
Oh,
system on the
wow.
inside. They can move the goats around and have them basically do
Awesome.
massive fire reduction. And I don't know how
Yeah.
they got that implemented, but it's been something that I've always kept my eye on because I just think again, it's like there's some certain small pockets of people doing pretty innovative stuff off grid, off
Yeah.
that are out of the purview of I think most people. And yeah, they seem to be thriving in that spot, and it's just cool seeing them kind
That's
of
great.
create newer systems like that. And with goats in
Yeah. And
particular,
hopefully they're able to stay.
I mean, yeah, they tried to move them out like 2 years ago. They built a newer housing spot for them in a different neighborhood, and I don't think any of them went because it's just,
Mhm.
why would they? Anyway, they're fine. They're not disturbing
Yeah.
anybody. It's fine the way they are. It's basically just the neighborhood association hates them because they get to exist outside of the state. They're stateless
Right.
people, and that makes them a threat, I
Mhm.
think, to people who
Yeah.
uh, or maybe even jealous on some level for people who don't
Yeah.
have to participate in property taxes or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah.
There's probably all kinds of interesting psychological analysis that could be done. But yeah, I think about that as like rewilding, like the sort of forefront of rewilding. It's cool to like hear you that you're doing it on this particular level, and then there's also this like micro level of it happening, just down the street from where I live. So that's exciting.
Yeah, that is. I mean, when I remember during the Occupy movement, when it was more active, we went to the camp in Eugene, and we were helping them develop a permaculture plan for the site with
Yeah.
gray water and rainwater catchment
Yeah.
and building straw bale houses. I mean,
Yeah.
I think those spaces, like you're saying, have so much potential to just, really meet more of their needs in a small scale, site-based way, and that's
Yeah.
very exciting.
Um, I also just, to kind of wrap up about the book Beyond the War, I also like that you're not like adamantly against any herbicide use whatsoever. I mean, I am because I can be a fanatic like that. But I like that you take this sort of more practical approach to, I think, bridging the gaps. At least that was my take, was that you definitely were more like, while you're, I think, against it, you definitely can meet people where they're at and still be able to kind of come up with a management plan to pull them further along in a direction of organic management.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use them, and I
Yeah.
don't, in all the plans that I do, I'm very transparent. Like, I'm not going to help people with that. Um, there's lots of other resources that they
Sure.
can go to if that's what they want to do. Um, but I really do. I know, I feel like I understand where people are coming from in feeling the need to use them. And I also understand the kind of management goals of many of these different parties, from parks departments to the BLM to Forest Service, and people's needs and ideologies around land management.
Yeah.
But I think just having these kinds of conversations about more regenerative options is always very interesting. And so many people have contacted me and say, I've worked for these agencies for my whole career, and I've always felt the same way. I've never wanted to use herbicide. I'm so grateful, that this information is out there and we can start having these conversations. So it's almost like it opened up this
Totally.
space that,
Yes.
just kind of needed to
Yes.
be said.
Yeah.
And not in like a way of conflicting or telling people that they're wrong,
Totally.
because that
Yeah.
doesn't really get very far.
Right. Exactly. No, they've done studies. It
But,
doesn't work. Yeah. Yeah. I had a similar thing
trying to
happen
create
too with the Parks Department here in town, where people came up to me when I was like being vocal with some of the management at parks, and some of the employees were like, I used to work for like, a conservation group, and we were adamantly against herbicides, and it's not what I want to be doing. I just want you to know that about me, and I'm like, oh man, that sucks. I'm sorry. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I've thought about too is like just sending a copy of your book to like everybody in the top of the parks department, just to get it in their hands, even if they don't even read it, just to know that it exists. I think that might be, one of my goals anyway, is to send that out just to get people to be thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, and I'm always happy to talk to people too, and
Yeah. Awesome.
have those kinds of hard conversations.
Yeah. So yeah, what kind of questions did you have for me?
Well, I'd love to hear about the work that you're doing with invasive species in Portland, and
Awesome.
I see some stuff on
Yeah.
social media sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it started out, it was one of the first times we used to do this. Well, we still do. The free skill series is like Rewild Portland's #1 longest running program. It's just like a free class on anything in the last Saturday of the month. But we used to do it at the archery range. And one day there, maybe 2009 or so, I was like, I had learned to weave baskets with willows and different material, but we'd always kind of seen these piles of ivy around the parks where they pull it and mulch it. And, one day somebody was like, I wonder if you could weave with that. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. And then that kind of sat away in the back of my head for a while. And then, one day at the archery range, I just pulled a bunch of ivy, went home and wove a basket. It's been a long journey learning, ins and outs of English ivy, kind of learning, what its strengths and weaknesses are as a fiber art, as a material for weaving, and branching into different invasive species like blackberry, Scotch broom. This year, my plan is to really dive into yellow flag iris. So I've identified a few places that have yellow flag iris. My biggest concern with that one is this, that it's an aquatic plant and theoretically could be taking up a lot of herbicide, especially if they're spot spraying it. I don't know how much Metro does, in some of their sites like Smith and Bybee. But I do know that, there's like signs everywhere that say like, don't do this or that. But there's turtles walking around, so they're not without three eyes, at least at this point. So I feel like I'll probably experiment with yellow flag iris. But yeah, I think, that was one of the reasons why I liked your book so much, was that it gave me more of a sort of political, philosophical groundedness in the work that we've been doing here for a while, in terms of figuring out how to use invasive species. I think it started out just thinking about them as an abundant resource, right? Like everybody wants to get rid of invasive species. They're free, willows, to weave a basket with willows, you got to buy the willows or grow them yourself, or collect them. But, a lot of the willows around here aren't great for basket weaving. So, people are buying or growing the European varieties that have been used for thousands of years for that purpose. But, so for me, it was like a free resource that people wanted me to take, like you call the parks department, you're like, hey, is it okay if I pull English ivy? They're like, is it? Please. And then, it just kind of blew up from there, I think. And now we're, most of the stuff that not most of, but a large part of what we do is working with invasive species. And when we teach things like foraging ethics and stuff like that, one of the number one principles is like invasives first. And, I think in part, because you don't really have to do a lot of tending the wild with a species that's so prolific, right? Like Scotch broom doesn't need my help spreading it, right? And so we do invasives first as a way of like thinking about being a new predator, something like that, a plant that is that prolific doesn't have a lot of predation. So how can we become a predator for that plant to limit their population growth? And then the second part of that would be, to plant back natives that you're harvesting. I think, there's in Tending the Wild, I think it was, or maybe one of Nancy Turner's books, they talk about camas, which was a staple crop, from where I'm at all the way down to where you are. And, one of the things they did was when they harvested it, they planted the seeds back in the ground at the same time. A lot of different cultures did that. And so there was this like reciprocity happening. And, one time I went and hung out with this woman, Phoenicia Madrano, who I won't get into Phoenicia right now, but I don't know if you know who she was or not, but big character, one of my biggest teachers. I was visiting with her in Eastern Oregon, and her sort of like gang that she had, we were driving around and we saw a tiger lily in the middle of nowhere, and it was all by itself. And they were like, oh my God, a tiger lily. And I was like, oh, a tiger lily. It's so precious. Like they're so rare. And all of them were like, kill it. And they ran over to it. And I was like, oh my God, what are you doing? And they dug it up, and I saw that it had all those little rootlets all the way around it. It had all these little like grains of rice that were little bulbs, right? And they planted those all over the place. So the next time they were to come back there, they would have like, multiplied that species by at least 10. I think there were at least 10 of those little rootlets. And so just kind of thinking about that, right? Of like, so if we're harvesting invasives, and then when we do harvest native plants, we understand how to make them more prolific again. That's kind of the flip side, I think, to our work with invasive species, is like not just pulling invasive species, but planting back natives, right? Yeah, so that's kind of in a nutshell, our work with invasive species, everything from dye plants to fiber plants to food and medicine, and then working with natives in terms of planting them back.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Are you growing stuff at the Green Acres site?
Yeah, we have a nursery there. There's a large garden that was built there, and then we bought the greenhouse that's there. So we grow lots of different fiber plants. Not all of them are native. Ivy is, it's funny. The other main director of Rewild Portland's
Oh, right.
programs, her name's Ivy, which is pretty funny. So she handles most of the growing stuff over there, and grows lots of fiber and dye and food and medicine and
Mm,
stuff. Yeah. And then we have like a spring
I'd
plant
love to
sale.
check it out sometime.
Oh, you totally should. It's small, but it's like, we can do quite a bit in there for what it is. So,
Cool. It's a cool spot.
yeah. Awesome.
Great.
Cool. Well, if you don't have any other questions, yeah, we can wrap it up.
Okay. Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah,
to
thank you so
catch
much
up.
for coming on. Yeah, it's good to chat with you. I hope people get a chance to read your book. Is there any other projects you've got going on that you want to mention, or any other ways people can get in touch with you or follow your work?
Um, well, I don't really post on social media that much these days anymore. Um, but I do have my website, and I probably will be doing more speaking events and stuff if the COVID situation is lightening up more and more, maybe more outdoor events.
Awesome. And what's
Um,
your website, just
so
so
yeah,
listeners can know?
it's uh it's www.theresiliencepermaculture.com. So yeah, I have
Awesome.
all the links on there. So be in touch.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and become a patron at patreon.com/PeterMichaelBauer.